Hi, in this video I will be demonstrating how easy it is for you to get your Next.js static application into AWS. This video will demonstrate how you can do this via infrastructure as code, and we'll be using CDK, the cloud development kit that AWS has to offer. For the purpose of this demonstration, we'll be using the create next app Next.js template, as you see here, that we can easily use. But first of all, we will show an architecture diagram of what we will be creating through infrastructure as code, and you will be able to see that we will be using Route 53, Cloudfront, and S3 to store the content. So all of the HTML files, the assets, everything will live in the S3. So just so everyone starts with the same code, we'll be using this download starter kit, which is here. So just easily copy and paste it, or in your case, you will use your existing Next.js application. Okay, so the starter code has installed. You can see the folder structure here, which I've already opened in VS Code. We've got the pages folder, the post folder. As expected, it might change in the future, but it will always, be something similar to this. Just to set expectations, this video is only for statically served content. So if you are making use of the API routes that come with Next.js, for example, the starter demonstration is, we will then need to remove it. This is because we are not, or we won't be running any server-side code inside cloud, because we are pointing our CloudFront origin to S3. Then we will not be able to do that. Merely with Next Export, I'll just demonstrate how easy you can use this, and this will basically show how you can export your next application just to get it to generate HTML or any assets you've created. But I will quickly do this with the scripts command, so I'll just create something similar. Next export. So so if you run npm run export, you will be able to make use of next export. In this case, we will first need to build Next.js, and this will allow us to then export. So let's do that first. So in the terminal, you would run next build, and this will generate a production build, as you can see here what it's doing, based upon the current changes in your application. So you see, yes, it's generated that. So then let's go to npm run export, and we should now see that we have this .next file, which is to do with the build, and then we'll have this .out file, which is done by the export. And you'll notice that it is HTML. The favicons in there, so anything within public will get copied into there. So you can also see images. So this all moves into out. Some stuff which Next.js and static Next.js relies on will get put inside the underscore next folder, and you will have the 404 and the index.html. Okay, so now that the introduction into the context behind the starter application and using export with it, we will now go on to using the infrastructure as code within the repository. And just to mention that in this case, I will be putting the infrastructure as code as part of the application itself. I know in some cases it might make sense to have an individual repository that manages all the infrastructure. Obviously, there are pros and cons to each solution, so just take that in mind. Okay, so we'll be installing a few packages, mainly the CDK ones, and we'll also use TypeScript to type the infrastructure. So the packages we will need to install in terms of CDK are the certificate manager, the Route 53 one. Also, there's a AWS Route 53 target group. Sorry. Okay, so that's core. We need the core. We also need the core, so CDK/core, and also AWS CDK itself, so we can save that. We'll also need TypeScript and source map support. Save. Okay, so we will also need to install Cloudfront and S3, easily done by the following. Okay, so with the packages installed, you should now have something similar in terms of the packages that we are using. So let's go on and create the CDK folder. So this is where we will write our infrastructure as code, and we will start with creating an index.ts file for TypeScript and a stack.ts file. So the stack is where we'll write our infrastructure requirements, so the resources we want to use, and then our index.ts file within the CDK folder will call and create the stack. So let's start with importing the packages that we are going to use. So we know that we are going to use Cloudfront. Also going to use Route 53. We'll end up using the targets of Route 53, so let's define them now. Also be using S3. And we'll also be using the core. Okay, so let's create the structure for the stack. So we will just simply create a class that extends the CDK.stack base class, something similar to that. We'll then define the constructor, and this just takes the construct and a unique identifier as a parameter. We'll also then pass it in to super. So the base class gets it. And in this case, we will then also supply an account and region, which will be supplied at runtime through process environment variable. And it's just for CDK. Okay, so now let's define the outline of what we want to create. So we know that we need to retrieve the hosted zone, the host zone. And this is for the Route 53 for the domain. We'll also need to create an S3 bucket, store files in. Also need to create a certificate for Cloudfront, and we will also need to create distribution and a record to point the user to the Cloudfront distribution. Okay, so let's start with the hosted zone. So because we've already done the imports, we can just use following, which will allow us to pull an existing hosted zone. Now the domain name variable points to your hosted zone, which you can see here. So for example, one of my hosted zones is for developwrite.co.uk. So this is what your hosted zones should point to. So you'll need to create a hosted zone within AWS yourself, and then it should have the value that is here. So in this case, it's developwrite. So let's write that in. And that should be that. So the hosted zone will be able to be pulled. Now we will want to write the resource to create the S3. So let's do that. So S3, okay, this. So this is just the identifier, and now the attributes we will need the bucket to be created with. It's entirely up to you, but I like to keep the format of what the URL is going to be. So in this case, let's call it static nextjs.developwrite.co.uk. And we're probably going to reuse this, so let's define it as a const. Let's call it path name. Let's call it site URL. Hope that little bit makes sense. So then we will update the bucket name to be associated to that. We also want the website index to be index.html, as you would expect. Also want the S3 to have public read access, and this is optional, but you can also specify a removal policy. By default, if you run CDK destroy, the bucket will not be deleted, and this is just how to enforce that. So let's move on to the certificate on. Now, the certificate on will be created automatically as long as you follow this. So you will be supplying a site domain, the hosted domain. So with this resource, the certificate on will be created for you, as the DNS will be validated for you. So let's start writing that. So we'll create a. So we'll use the ACM package. So we'll use the ACM package. DNS validated certificate. So I just realized that we'd never imported the ACM package, so let's go and do that now. ACM. Okay, so let's create the certificate, and we'll call it certificate on, since that's the property we want from it, and we'll end up using it further on. So the properties it wants it to be supplied is the domain name, which we're going to supply in site URL. We also need to supply the hosted zone, which we know we've already pulled from, and the region is US East 1, which is standard for ACM certificates. Now we want to pull the certificate on and set the variable to that, so set the property like that. Moving on, we will then create the distribution. So let's do that with the Cloudfront package, which we've already imported, and we want to use the Cloudfront web distribution, site distribution. So this is giving it a unique identifier. Now the parameters we will need to supply to it are the following. So we'll need to supply an alias configuration, set ref. So we're going to pass the certificate we've created like that. Names. So this will be what what names do we want the Cloudfront distribution to use, so the aliases. So in this case, it's the same. So we will import the site URL, use it there. Now the SSL method is optional, but I prefer TLS, and you don't need the highest type of security policy, but it's entirely up to you. The best thing about having it done via infrastructure as code is that you can easily change it. So that's the alias configuration created. Now let's move on to the origins config. So this is where we'll be pointing it to the bucket domain name, because when you statically serve content from an S3 bucket, it gets given a public domain name, and internally within AWS will handle the routing from CloudFront to S3 to pull the contents. So let's create that. So that we have to set a custom origin with the domain name that we want. So let's just point it to the site, to the S3 bucket, and we want the bucket website domain name, which is a property of the object that's created when you create the resource. I would also need to supply the origin protocol policy, which we will just set as HTTP only, because this is the routing between CloudFront and S3, and we do not need it to be secure. Okay, so let's follow on and create behaviors. And we just want default behavior true. So with that being the distribution, we can now move on to creating an A record. So let's do that. Route 53, A record. Now we want the record to be created for the domain we want. So if you just scroll back up, we've got static nextjs.developbrowser.co.uk. So let's set it to that site URL, and we will need the target. This is where we point anyone who accesses static next.js.developWrite will then eventually be routed to this target. So in this case, our target will be CloudFront. Luckily with CDK, we're having lots of community support and heavy buy-in from AWS at high level. There are a lot of helper packages, there are a lot of CDK examples that you can find online. Feel free to have a look. So we'll just need to pass in the distribution, and we also need to supply the hosted name zone, and that should be that. So what we should have here is the ability to create an S3 bucket, create a certificate that goes with the CloudFront distribution that we'll create. This CloudFront distribution will look inside the S3 bucket and route requests to it and retrieve the content, and then we've connected the Route 53 A record to use the CloudFront. So when a user goes to the website, they will hit CloudFront, and if CloudFront hasn't got whatever the user requested in cache, assuming it exists, then it will retrieve it from S3. What we haven't done so far is we haven't been able to get this out directory that we have for Next.js into the S3 bucket automatically. So now you could probably stop at this point and create the infrastructure and then copy these files into the S3 bucket, and eventually it should work. You should be able to see the content, but we're going to continue and allow it to be done automatically in this case. So let's go on and create the S3 deploy. Okay, so what we'll go on to use, we're using a help package that is supplied by CDK, and we can easily make use of this by installing AWS S3 deployment. So let's go on and do that. So okay, so now that we've done that, we can go back to VS Code, use the package. So I'll just create a new comment. So copy out folder to S3. So let's go and do that. So we use S3 deploy, bucket deployment, this deploy to bucket. So we need to use the S3 to pull our assets. So let's do that. So we will have to point it to the out, and it'll handle that for us. So the destination bucket is, let's just refer back to it. So we've called it site URL. So let's call that distribution and the distribution path. Okay, so the destination bucket just needs to be the S3 object, and it'll work it out itself. So now that we've got that, we should be able to deploy the infrastructure and then deploy the code inside of S3. So let's go on and talk about deploying. So we should already have the CDK files installed, or packages. Okay, so now that the stack file has been written, we will now want to write the index.ts to call the stack file. So let's quickly do that. So first we will define the environment file, the file, and we will import a source map register. So we import the stack, and then we will define CDK as an app. So you can hit to initialize, and then we run the stack. So NextJS stack. As simple as that. Okay, so there is something that was missed. You will need to install the types dev dependency for Node. This will just ensure that when you run TypeScript, it will understand the type of processed env. Without that, it will complain. So let's continue on and write the code to run CDK. So because we should already have CDK installed, but we are using TypeScript, we will need to run the TypeScript compilation for the index.ts file and the stack. So all we need to do is use the following cdk/index.ts, and then we will just need to use the CDK file. Cool. Furthermore, we'll also need to set up a CDK.json, and this will just tell CDK what it needs to run, like what the entry point for CDK is. So if we go with following, create an app property and node, because when we run the command index.ts will we'll end up creating index.js. We'll point it to that. Okay, so along with the TSC command, we'll also need to supply different additional arguments. So we'll need to supply the target, the module resolution, and the module. This can be defined in a tsconfig.json file, but in this case, we're just going to run it through the command line. That should be it for the CDK script. Now you'll also need to ensure that you have your AWS credentials set up. Now I will link in the description how you can go about doing that, but the easiest way is to log into your AWS account. The easiest way to get your AWS credentials set up and ready, if you don't have them available, is to go to the AWS account and go to your security credentials, which is based on your account. Go to your access keys tab and create new access keys. You will need to paste them into the terminal, or you can use the CLI to export them. Okay, so once you've done that, you should be ready to build the CDK. We can do that by using the script we created before, the npm run CDK with deploy. That's because we wanted to deploy the CDK application, so let's do that. So this will take quite a while because it'll need to create all the infrastructure. And as you can see here, it gives you a type of change log, so what it's going to create. Obviously anything in green is an addition. And considering this is the first run, everything should be in green. So let's run that. This will take a while. Okay, so now that the CDK deploy has finished, you can see here it's reported done. It did take a little bit, but it's completed now, and you can confirm it by looking at the CloudFormation stack. You can see that it's done here, has all the resources that were created in there. If you're interested, feel free to have a look. I also took the opportunity to take a look at the static NextJS S3 bucket that we created, and we can see that it's got the out directory in there, and that was done by the code here, and that's just copied over these assets here. So if we now go to the URL, let's do it here. Let's copy that, make it easy for ourselves. There we go. We can see that the static application has been put into CloudFront, and it's using S3 to serve the to retrieve the content from. You see here, so we've got all these posts. So this is how you get a static NextJS application into CloudFront.